January 27th, 1945. The snow was deep. The temperature was -20. The soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army were pushing through southern Poland, expecting German resistance. What they found instead was something no military briefing had ever prepared them for. But this story is not just about the soldiers who arrived first. This story is about the Americans who came after. The investigators, the journalists, the generals, the men who walked through the gates weeks later, when the smoke had cleared, when the SS had fled, when the silence had settled over the largest killing machine in human history. This is the story of what they found, and what they did about it. When American forces first entered the liberated Auschwitz complex in the weeks following liberation, they arrived as witnesses, as investigators, as prosecutors. They came with cameras and notepads and a mandate to document. But documentation requires looking, and looking at Auschwitz broke something in every single man who did it. The camp stretched for miles. It was not one camp. It was a city of death. Auschwitz, 1, the main camp. Auschwitz 2, Birkenau, the extermination center. Auschwitz 3, Monowitz, the slave labor factory. 47 subcamps radiating outward like a cancer. The SS had built a civilization whose only product was corpses. The Americans walked through it all. They saw the barracks where prisoners slept 5 to a wooden plank, stacked 3 levels high in buildings designed for horses. They saw the latrines, open pits where prisoners were given 30 seconds twice a day to relieve themselves or be beaten. They saw the Wall of Death, a black courtyard where the SS shot prisoners for sport, for discipline, for nothing at all. They kept walking. They saw the warehouses, the Canadians, the prisoners called them, massive storage buildings filled with the belongings of the dead. Hundreds of thousands of suitcases, mountains of shoes, children's shoes, tiny shoes with buckles and scuff marks from playgrounds, 7 tons of human hair shaved from the heads of women before they were killed, bundled and tagged for shipment to German textile factories. One American officer stopped in front of the hair. He stood there for a long time. He did not speak. His sergeant later said he had never seen the man cry before that day. He cried then. And then they found the survivors, 7,000 of them, left behind when the SS fled. The Germans had evacuated over 50,000 prisoners on foot in the dead of winter, a death march westward, shooting anyone who fell. They left behind only those too sick and too weak to walk. They expected them to die before anyone arrived. They did not die, but they were not living either. They were skeletons wrapped in striped rags, lying in their own waste, staring at the ceiling with eyes that had forgotten how to blink. Some weighed less than 70 pounds. American medical personnel who entered the barracks said the smell hit them like a physical wall. Gangrene, dysentery, death. A young American Army nurse from Wisconsin knelt beside a woman on a wooden plank. The woman reached out and touched the nurse's hand. She said one word in Polish, "Dziękuję," thank you. The nurse held her hand and did not let go for a very long time. But while the nurses tended to the dying, others were looking for the living SS. Most of the guards had fled west ahead of the Soviet advance. They had removed their uniforms. They had forged papers. They had melted into the retreating German civilian population. They believed they would disappear. They believed the scale of what they had done was too enormous to ever be fully prosecuted. They believed they would get away with it. Some did, but many did not. American counterintelligence units, the CIC, fanned out across occupied Germany in the months following liberation. They had lists, names pulled from captured SS rosters, from testimony given by survivors, from documents the Germans had meticulously kept because they were Germans and Germans kept records of everything, including murder. The CIC agents were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were lawyers and academics and linguists in uniform. But what they had seen in Auschwitz had changed them the same way it changed everyone who saw it. One agent, a Jewish American from New York whose parents had fled Europe in the 1930s, was assigned to track an SS sergeant named Otto Moll. Moll was not a senior officer. He was not a general or a commandant. He was a working man of death. He personally supervised the burning of bodies at the Birkenau crematoriums. Survivors testified that he shot prisoners for entertainment, that he threw living children into burning pits, that he whistled while he worked. The agent tracked Moll for weeks across the American occupation zone. He finally found him hiding in a farmhouse outside Munich, wearing civilian clothes, claiming to be a displaced farmer. The agent arrested him quietly. He put him in handcuffs. He walked him to the vehicle. Later, his partner asked him, "How did you not kill him right there?" The agent was quiet for a moment. He said, "Because I wanted him to stand in front of a judge. I wanted the whole world to hear what he did. A bullet would have been too fast, too quiet, too merciful." That was the official position. Justice through law. The Nuremberg framework. The belief that civilization had to prove it was better than the monsters it was prosecuting. But not everyone felt that way. In the weeks immediately following liberation, before the courts were established, before the official framework was in place, there were incidents, documented incidents, incidents that the army investigated, recorded, and in many cases quietly buried. At a collection point near Auschwitz, a group of captured SS guards were being held for processing. Among them was a man survivors identified as a particularly brutal block guard, a man known for selecting prisoners for the gas chamber personally, pointing left or right with his thumb, the way you might sort apples. The survivors who identified him were barely alive. They could hardly stand, but they could point. And they pointed at him. The American soldiers holding the collection point were young men from Ohio and Georgia and Pennsylvania. They had spent the last hour being shown around the camp by a survivor who spoke broken English. They had seen the gas chambers. They had seen the Zyklon B canisters still stacked near the doors. They had seen the scratch marks on the interior walls where people had clawed at the concrete in the dark. The block guard knew he had been identified. He could see it in the soldiers' faces. He started talking. He spoke in German, rapidly, a stream of words none of the Americans understood. He was probably explaining himself, justifying, following orders, the usual architecture of excuse. One soldier, a corporal from Cleveland, raised his rifle. His sergeant put a hand on the barrel and pushed it down. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." The corporal looked at him. His hands were shaking. The sergeant held his gaze. He said, I know, but not like this." The block guard was processed and handed to investigators. He stood trial at the Auschwitz trial in Krakow in 1947. He was convicted. He was hanged. The corporal from Cleveland went home. He worked at a hardware store for 40 years. His family said he never watched war movies. He never talked about what he saw. Every January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation, he went quiet for the whole day. His daughter said she only learned what he had witnessed when she read his diary after he died. He had written, "I should have pulled the trigger. I have never stopped wondering if the right thing and the legal thing were the same thing that day." He was not the only one asking that question. The Americans who processed Auschwitz war criminals operated in a moral landscape that had no map. The laws existed. The Nuremberg principles existed. But the laws had been written by people who had never stood in a warehouse full of 7 tons of human hair, who had never knelt beside a 70-pound woman on a wooden plank, who had never looked into the eyes of a man who had pointed his thumb and sent 1,000 people to die, and then gone home and eaten dinner. Some Americans held the line. They processed, they documented, they testified, they built the legal cases that sent dozens of SS personnel to the gallows through proper courts of law. Others did not hold the line. There were beatings during interrogations. There were prisoners who arrived at collection points with injuries that had not been there when they were arrested. There were guards who were documented as having died while attempting to escape, a phrase that investigators sometimes used and sometimes did not investigate too deeply. General Dwight Eisenhower ordered every American unit in the area to tour the liberated camps. He said, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." Eisenhower himself walked through Auschwitz. He walked through the barracks. He walked through the warehouses. He walked through the gas chambers. He came out and he said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Document everything. Photograph everything. Because the day will come when people say this never happened." He was right about that. The men who walked through Auschwitz in those weeks carried it forever. The nurses who held the hands of the dying, the investigators who tracked the killers across occupied Germany, the soldiers who stood in front of warehouses full of children's shoes and felt something inside them change permanently. They came home. They got jobs. They had families. They went to church on Sundays and coached Little League and argued about baseball. And in the quiet moments, in the dark, they were still there, still walking through those gates, still smelling that smell, still seeing those shoes. The men who came home from Auschwitz did not come home whole. They came home with the address of a place that does not let you leave, a place that follows you into the grocery store, into the backyard on a Sunday afternoon, into the bedroom at 3 a.m. when the house is quiet and everyone else is sleeping and you are standing again in a warehouse full of children's shoes, wondering how the world allowed it. They did not talk about it. That was the rule of their generation. You came home. You moved forward. You did not burden your family with what you carried, so they carried it alone. One veteran, a former CIC agent who helped prosecute multiple Auschwitz SS personnel, was interviewed in his 80s. He was a small man by then, white-haired, soft-spoken. He had a photograph of his grandchildren on the table beside him. The interviewer asked him if he had any regrets about how the prosecutions were handled, whether justice had truly been served. He sat with the question for a long time. He looked out the window. He looked at his hands. Then he said, "We got some of them. We hanged some of them. Some of them died in prison, and some of them lived long, comfortable lives and died in their beds, surrounded by their grandchildren, and were buried with flowers on their graves." He paused. He said, "I think about the ones who got away more than I think about the ones we caught. I think about them every single day. I wonder where they went. I wonder what they told their children about the war. I wonder if they slept well." He looked at the interviewer. He said, "Does that answer your question? The Americans prosecuted many. They did not prosecute all. The machinery of justice, even at its most determined, could not move as fast as the machinery of escape, false identities, sympathetic priests, rat lines running south through Italy into South America. Some of the worst men who ever lived boarded ships and started over with new names in new countries and grew old in the sun. But some were caught, some stood trial. Rudolf Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz. He personally oversaw the murder of more than 1 million people. He designed the systems. He approved the expansions. He wrote memos about efficiency. He was not a screaming fanatic. He was a manager, a bureaucrat of death who took pride in his work and optimized it like a production line. When American investigators found him, he was hiding on a farm in northern Germany, calling himself Franz Lang. He had been there for months. His wife knew where he was. His children visited him. He was arrested, extradited to Poland, and tried before a Polish tribunal. During the trial, he was calm, cooperative, almost clinical. He explained the logistics of mass murder the way an engineer explains the load-bearing capacity of a bridge. He described the selection process, the capacity of the crematoria, the improvements he had made over the methods used at other camps. He expressed regret of a kind. He said he had been following orders. He said he had not hated the prisoners personally. He was hanged on April 16, 1947. The gallows were built next to the crematorium at Auschwitz I, on the same ground, beside the same building, a few meters from where he had built his machinery of death. Justice of a kind. But here is the question that the men who walked through those gates never stopped asking themselves. They had a choice. Every one of them had a choice. Follow the rules, build the courts, trust the process, believe that civilization, that law, that order and procedure and due process were worth preserving, even when confronted with the greatest crime in the history of the human race. Or don't. Most of them followed the rules. Most of them held the line. And because they did, there were trials. There was testimony placed on the record before judges and the watching world. There is documentation, permanent and unimpeachable, of exactly what happened at Auschwitz and exactly who did it and exactly how it worked. That record exists because those men believed the record mattered more than the revenge. And maybe they were right. Maybe the record is the thing. Maybe the trials and the transcripts and the photographs and the testimony are worth more in the long run than a bullet in a farmhouse outside of Munich. Maybe the point was never punishment. Maybe the point was proof. Proof that it happened. Proof that cannot be argued away or dismissed or called a lie by people who were not there. Eisenhower said it. Document everything. Because the day will come when people say this never happened. That day came. It is here. It has been here for decades. and the only thing standing between the truth and the erasure of it is the record those men built. Or maybe the corporal from Cleveland was right. Maybe some things are beyond the reach of courts and transcripts and due process. Maybe there are crimes so total, so absolute, so complete in their evil, that the only honest response is not a gavel, but a trigger. Maybe the law is a system built for a world where certain things are assumed to be impossible, and Auschwitz proved those assumptions wrong, and you cannot use the old tools to answer the new reality. Maybe he should have pulled the trigger. There is no clean answer. There has never been a clean answer. The men who were there knew it. The ones who held the line knew it. The ones who did not hold the line knew it. They all lived with the weight of the choice they made and the choice they did not make for the rest of their lives. If you had walked through those gates, if you had stood in that warehouse, if you had seen the scratch marks on the walls of the gas chamber, and then looked into the face of the man who locked the door, would you have trusted the courts? Or would you have trusted yourself? Be honest. Let me know in the comments. And if you want to see what happened when American soldiers discovered the Nazi gold hidden deep in a German salt mine, click the video on screen. Thanks for watching.